Reed Cavanaugh had not expected the afternoon to cost him anything. He had driven down from Gloucester on a Tuesday in late October to pick up a shipment of voltage regulators. A colleague had forwarded through the cargo terminal at Logan Airport, and he had planned to be back at his workshop before dark. He was 52 years old and had long since stopped expecting his days to surprise him. 18 years of running a small electrical engineering firm from the back half of a converted boat shed had worn the edges off most of his surprises. He was crossing the main arrivals hall when the crowd shifted and he saw her. She was standing near the far end of the terminal by the international gates, slightly apart from the stream of travelers, dressed in a gray coat Reed did not recognize, but wearing her hair the way she had always worn it, pulled back at the sides in a way that left her face entirely visible. She was older, 24 years older, but the shape of her jaw, the way she tilted her chin slightly downward, when her attention sharpened on something, the particular way she stood with her weight on her left foot, and her shoulders drawn in as though she were trying to take up less space than she actually needed. Reed would have known that posture in a room full of strangers even if he had been going blind. Beside her stood a young woman who could not have been older than 23. She had dark hair and Reed's own mouth, and, when she turned to say something to the older woman beside her, a pair of dark brown eyes that Reed had looked at every morning in his bathroom mirror for the entirety of his adult life. His chest did something he had no name for. He stood in the middle of the moving crowd and could not make his legs work. Her name was Celeste Varro Cavanaugh. She had been declared legally dead following a boating accident off the coast of Gloucester Harbor on a May afternoon 24 years ago. There had been a recovered life jacket, a shattered section of hull, a Coast Guard report, a memorial service Reed had sat through with his 3-year-old son Nathan on his knee, the boy too young to understand any of it, but old enough to keep asking in a quiet, bewildered voice where Mommy had gone. Reed said her name before he had consciously decided to. She heard it. He watched her go completely still, and then she turned her head very slowly in the direction the sound had come from, and when her eyes found his across 40 feet of crowded terminal, something moved across her face that was not joy, and was not relief, and was not guilt exactly, but was some compound of all three that she had clearly been carrying for a long time. She took the younger woman's arm and moved quickly toward the side doors. He caught them on the sidewalk outside in the cold air, a line of taxis pulling away at the curb and the smell of exhaust mixing with the first thin suggestion of rain off the harbor. He asked her, in a voice he barely recognized as his own, to explain to him what he was looking at. Celeste would not look directly at him. Her eyes kept moving to a silver sedan, idling 40 yards down the departure lane, its windows dark enough that Reed could not see whether it was occupied. She told him they could not have this conversation in a place with cameras and foot traffic, that every moment they stood in the open was a moment that cost them something he did not yet understand. The young woman beside her had been watching Reed the entire time, with an expression that was careful and deliberate, cataloging his face the way a person does when they are trying to decide whether something they have long wanted to believe is actually true. She asked her mother, in a voice that was steadier than her face suggested. She felt whether the man standing in front of them was her father. Reed drove them to his workshop in Gloucester because it was the only place he could think of where no one would come looking for him without a specific reason to try. For a long time after they arrived, the three of them sat in the part of the shop where Reed kept the project he was never quite in a hurry to finish. A 1971 Johnson outboard motor that had belonged to his own father, spread across a canvas tarp on a work table in the corner. A portable heater ticked beside the far wall. Outside, rain had begun in earnest, drumming against the metal roof in the way it always did in October when the wind came in off the water. The young woman introduced herself as Phoebe Varro. She said the name with a slight pause before the surname, as though she was still deciding whether it fit. She had grown up in Portland, Oregon, raised by her mother under the name Phoebe Crane, and had spent the past 4 years finishing a nursing degree. While slowly trying to make sense of a family history her mother had never been willing to explain in full. 2 weeks earlier, she had received a letter from the estate of a man named Corbin Slate, a former security director for a company called Varro Ashby Holdings, whose instructions had been that the letter be delivered to Phoebe only in the event of his death. She had read it 3 times before calling her mother. Then she had driven to the address in the letter and knocked on a door and said her mother's name, and Celeste Cavanaugh had opened the door and begun to cry without saying a single word. Reed listened to all of this without interrupting and without changing his expression, which was the thing he did when he was most unsettled. He had a reputation among his clients for being impossibly calm under pressure. It was not a natural quality. It was something he had built, slowly and without acknowledgement, over the 2 decades he had spent raising Nathan alone. He told them plainly that resemblance was not proof, and that he had buried his grief 24 years ago at considerable cost, and that he would need something more solid than a letter from a dead man before he let himself believe a single thing he was currently looking at. Celeste reached into her bag and set a photograph on the work table between them. It was a picture of Reed and Nathan at the harbor, taken the summer Nathan had turned 8. Reed still had Nathan's school portrait from that same year on his office wall. He recognized his son's expression immediately, the slightly suspicious squint Nathan had used in every photograph until he was old enough to understand that smiling on purpose was an option. The photograph had clearly been taken with a long lens from some distance. The date printed on the border was 9 years after the morning Reed had scattered what he believed were Celeste's ashes into the harbor from a fishing boat belonging to her family. She had been watching them that whole time. Not always, not close, but enough to know they were safe. The story that came out over the next 3 hours carried Reed backward to the early years of their marriage. Before Nathan, before the engineering firm, when Celeste had still been trying to put enough distance between herself and the Varro name to feel like someone other than Bernard Varro's only daughter. Her father had built Varro Ashby Holdings across 4 decades of precision manufacturing and industrial patent development into something with offices in 6 states and a pension fund that supported 3,000 employees. He had died of a heart attack when Nathan was 8 months old, leaving control of the company to his younger brother Harlan under a structured trust, because Celeste had made it clear years earlier that she wanted nothing to do with the family business. What she had not understood at the time her father signed that trust was exactly what kind of man Harlan Varro was when no one with more authority than him was in the room. 3 months after Bernard's death, Celeste had found the first thread, a series of internal transfers that moved money from the employee pension fund into a subsidiary she had never heard of. She pulled on the thread because it bothered her the way a loose wire in a circuit bothers an engineer. Not because she was looking for trouble, but because the inconsistency was simply there, sitting in the open, and she could not make herself leave it alone. What she found beneath it was not a loose wire, but a fault running through the entire structure. Harlan had been redirecting pension contributions for years, filtering them through a series of shell companies that linked back eventually to accounts he controlled personally, and woven through those same records were forged signatures. Her father's name on documents Bernard had never seen, authorizing transfers he had never approved. Celeste had taken her evidence to a federal contact she believed she could trust. Within 48 hours, Corbin Slate arrived at her door. He had worked for her father for 20 years and was one of the few people inside the Varro organization who was genuinely loyal to the memory of the man, rather than to whoever currently controlled his money. He told her that the federal contact she had approached had already been compromised, and that Harlan had been notified of her inquiry. He showed her the photographs that had been delivered to Harlan's office. Reed at his workbench, Nathan in the backyard, specific enough to communicate that Harlan knew exactly where to find them. The accident was Corbin's idea. He arranged it carefully, using a contact at the Coast Guard station and a portion of hull from a boat already scheduled for disposal. He had told Celeste it would buy months, perhaps a year. Long enough for him to build a parallel case through channels Harlan had not yet reached. Those months became years, and those years became a silence so long that Celeste eventually stopped measuring it and simply lived inside it, moving between rented apartments in cities where no one knew her name, always with a bag she could pack in 4 minutes, always aware that Harlan's people had never entirely stopped looking. She had tried once to come back. 7 years after the accident, Corbin had arranged the earliest stages of a return that would have reunited her with Reed and introduced him to the daughter he did not yet know existed. Before that plan could go forward, Corbin went silent. Every channel she had used to communicate outside her hiding places went dark within days of his disappearance. She spent the following weeks convincing herself that any contact she attempted would draw Harlan's attention directly to Reed and Nathan, and the silence that had begun as a temporary precaution calcified, over time, into the only shape of her life she could still recognize. Nathan had tried to claim his inheritance at 24. He had hired a lawyer, presented his birth certificate, and appeared before the Varro-Ashby board. Harlan's legal team invoked a clause in Bernard's original trust that required, for any heir's claim to be validated, the living presence of Celeste Varro herself before the board, or alternatively a federal court order from a judge of no lower than district level. Harlan had spent 3 years burying Nathan's petition in procedural delay, transferring it between jurisdictions, disputing the evidentiary standard, burning through continuances until Nathan's attorney ran out of money and patience and advised his client to move on. Nathan had moved on. He had built a career as a structural engineer in Chicago. He had stopped checking the mailbox for anything related to the Varro name. He had, as far as Reed knew, stopped thinking about it. Reed called Nathan that night from the shop. His son arrived the following morning, having driven through the night from Chicago, already composing in his head the version of the conversation where he gently explained to his father that grief had made him vulnerable to an elaborate confidence scheme. That certainty lasted approximately 45 seconds after he walked through the workshop door and saw his mother's face. What followed was not a reunion. Nathan did not move toward her. He stood by the door with his hands in his jacket pockets and told her, in a voice so controlled and quiet it was more unsettling than shouting would have been, that he had a list of questions and he intended to ask all of them, and that he needed her to understand before she answered any of them, that he had watched his father work 2 jobs for most of his childhood without ever complaining about it, and that the last time he had cried was at the memorial service he barely remembered at age 3, and that he had no intention of crying today. Celeste did not try to soften any of it. She told him he was entitled to every question, and that she would answer them honestly, including the ones that did not make her look like a person worth defending. Phoebe watched her half-brother from across the room with an expression Reed recognized, because it was the expression he saw in his own face. Sometimes when he was working through a problem, too large to solve all at once, she was absorbing the weight of what her survival had cost someone she was only now meeting. She did not try to insert herself into the conversation. She simply sat with it. Reed reached out that evening to Stella Okafor, the attorney who had handled his business contracts for 15 years and whom he trusted precisely, because she said uncomfortable things without softening them first. She arrived at the workshop still in her work clothes, read through the documents Corbin Slate's letter referenced, and confirmed that the clause Harlan had used to block Nathan's claim was valid on its face. but that it had a specific vulnerability. If Celeste herself appeared before the board, alive, with a biological child and a DNA certification, the clause did not block the claim. It triggered it. The trust would automatically initiate a full audit of every pension account and subsidiary the company controlled. Bernard had designed it that way deliberately, she suspected. The old man had known what kind of person Harlan was and had built a mechanism into his own succession documents that could not be forged away. Harlan was 3 days from closing the sale of the company's core patent portfolio to an industrial conglomerate based in Seoul. Once those patents transferred, even a successful legal claim would recover a company hollowed to its frame. That, Stella explained, was why they were out of time. Harlan appeared at the workshop the following afternoon. He came alone, which surprised Reed, though it probably should not have. He walked through the shop with his hands behind his back and his eyes moving across the equipment, with the studied appreciation of a man who had spent his life learning how to seem interested in other people's work. He made his offer directly and without ceremony, $15 million. Deposited into an account of Reed's choosing within 72 hours. In exchange for a signed statement declaring that the women currently staying in his workshop were not who they claimed to be. He framed it as generosity. He said Reed deserved better than to spend his remaining years defending a dead woman's claim in a court case that would bankrupt him before it concluded. He said it the way a man says something, when he has already decided it is inevitable and is simply allowing the other person time to accept it. Reed looked at him across the work table where the disassembled motor had been for 6 years, waiting for him to get back to it, and told him no. Harlan made his first real mistake before he left. He referred to Phoebe by the full name she had used on her nursing school transcripts, a name known only to Celeste, Reed, Nathan, Stella, and Phoebe herself, which told Reed everything he needed to know about how long Harlan had been tracking the girl and how much he already knew about what was coming. Morris Trent arrived at the workshop at 11 that night. He was Varro Ashby's chief financial officer, a thin, deliberate man who had held the position for 22 years and who had, by his own account, spent most of those years finding ways to live with what he knew. He told them that Corbin Slate had come to him 12 years earlier with the original audit documents, fearing correctly that even a bank vault was not beyond Harlan's reach. Morris had kept them in his own home, locked in a fireproof box in his basement, telling himself for a decade that there would eventually come a moment when using them would make sense. The moment, he said, was that Harlan intended to liquidate the pension fund entirely as part of the Seoul transaction, not redirect it, liquidate it. 3,000 people, engineers and assembly workers and administrative staff who had spent decades paying into a fund they trusted, would receive a notice informing them that their retirement accounts had been dissolved in conjunction with a corporate restructuring. Morris had watched Harlan do many things over the years. He found he could not watch him do this one. He spread the original documents across the work table. Nathan sat down and went through them page by page, identifying the shell company structures the way he had once, as a teenager, taught himself to identify stress fractures in construction materials. Methodically, without flinching, following each line to its conclusion. By 2 in the morning, he had a complete map of the fraud, cross-referenced against the intercepted records, and Stella's supporting filings. They went to the Varro Ashby headquarters the following evening, all 5 of them, as the last hours before the deadline contracted around them. Harlan met them in the lobby himself. He stood in front of the elevator bank with the board members filing in behind him and told Reed, loudly enough for several of them to hear, that a retired electrician with a grudge against a family that had never owed him anything had finally arrived to embarrass himself in the appropriate setting. Morris Trent walked in behind them, carrying the documents. What followed happened quietly, and without the dramatic rupture Reed might have expected. The documents landed on the boardroom table one at a time. Stella presented Lydia Vance's signed statement. The former county records officer who had helped process the fraudulent death certificate and who had agreed, after years of silence, to testify in exchange for legal protection. The paternity confirmation Nathan had arranged through a private lab. The intercepted communications linking Harlan's network to the files. And finally, Morris's original audit documents, which were what they had all been looking for from the beginning, and which made everything else in the room simply a matter of time. Several board members who had sat through years of Harlan's presentations without asking a visible question now sat unable to meet his eyes. Harlan made one final attempt to push the soul signing through before midnight. Phoebe stopped it. She was 23 years old and had driven across the country on the strength of a dead man's letter and had sat through 2 days of a story that had shaped the whole contour of her life without her consent. She stood at the head of the table in a room full of people who had spent 2 decades making decisions that affected her family's future, and told them, in the same calm voice she used at nursing stations when she needed something done immediately, that the signing would not take place that evening. The sole deal collapsed before morning. Harlan Varro was removed from his position within the week, facing charges that included fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The pension fund restoration was Phoebe's first formal act as the trust's newly recognized heir, not because she wanted the authority, but because she could not leave the building knowing 3,000 people would spend another night unsure whether their retirements still existed. She retained a majority board seat but declined the operational role, choosing instead to return to Portland and finish her residency rotation. She told the board she intended to be useful in ways she had actually been trained for. Nathan was not ready to call Celeste his mother. He told her so, plainly and without cruelty, and she accepted it the way she had accepted most of the hard things said to her over the past 72 hours. Without deflection, without reaching for sympathy she had not earned. He agreed to let her send him a real phone number, the kind that went directly to her, without passing through anyone else first. Celeste asked Reed for something more modest than forgiveness. She asked for the chance to sit across a table from him sometime without the weight of an immediate emergency filling all the available space between them. He told her the marriage they had built had ended the morning the Coast Guard filed its report, and that whatever existed between them now would have to be something different, built carefully and without assumptions about what the old version had meant. She nodded once, the way a person nods when they have been expecting an honest answer and are relieved to receive it rather than something easier and less true. In the months that followed, the workshop returned to what it had always been, quiet, smelling of solder and machine oil, the old motor still waiting on its canvas tarp. Reed worked on it some evenings after the client projects were done, not urgently, in no particular hurry to finish. Phoebe came for Thanksgiving and spent most of the weekend in the workshop, watching Reed work and asking the kind of precise questions that engineers ask, the kind that strip away the decorative details and go straight to what is actually happening inside a mechanism. She had her mother's instinct for that kind of thinking. Reed recognized it without remarking on it, and she recognized that he recognized it, and neither of them said so. On the last afternoon of her visit, she stood beside him while he fitted the carburetor back into the motor's housing. She watched him work with the patient attention she had spent 3 years developing at nursing stations, where the difference between a correct reading and an assumption was the entire point. She called him Dad for the first time without preface or qualification, the way someone says a word when they have been holding it back long enough that it finally becomes the simplest available option. Reed did not answer right away. He set the carburetor wrench down on the workbench, wiped his hands on a rag that had been his father's before it was his, and looked at the motor that had been waiting patiently for years to be made whole again. Then he picked up the next piece, aligned it carefully against the housing, and got back to work. And the warmth that settled over the shop in that moment had nothing to do with the portable heater ticking against the far wall.